Of gas, we got to get into our net zero carbon segment. This episode, we are joined by Danny Gomez, who's going to help us with this net zero carbon episode brought to us by Convoy. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, Danny.
Morning, how are you guys doing?
Doing pretty good here in the scenic city. And we've got a really interesting topic on hand for us today, talking about the decision to drill or not to drill on federal land and what's going on there. We know that currently we are in a Democratic government who is a little bit less keen to let us produce oil and gas petroleum products using federal lands. And let's talk a little bit about that. Where's kind of the hangups and the holdbacks, and where are the proponents of this sitting?
Yeah, as you can imagine, it's a pretty debated topic, right? There's advocates on both sides of the fence. You know, we have created such a strong reliance on oil and gas here domestically. We're now, I think net exporting oil. So things have shifted. And, you take that kind of the historic and all the systems and the infrastructure we have in place around oil and gas and how ingrained it is in our day-to-day lives, not only from fuel usage, but even the products that we purchase off the shelves. It's really hard to think about conceptually moving away from those things. And a topic or a term that's we use commonly in net zero carbon is transition fuels. So we even recently did some episodes on hydrogen being a transition fuel or drop-in fuels being a transition fuel. And so I think, it's really, personally, I would love for us to make that transition as quick as possible. I think a lot of us would. I saw recently a McKinsey report that said Houston is now one of the largest hydrogen hubs in the world, where traditional oil and gas producers are making this shift themselves. Now, these things can't happen overnight, and we know that, and we have this infrastructure in place, and we have a lot of investments that have been made, and these investments weren't made, they were made medium and long term, right? And so there's a lot of interest in continuing to keep those things going. And I think that's what we have to try to figure out here is, the nuances between, and what is being said and what is being advocated for, and the headlines and the storylines that we're being told. I think in general, as a society, we were becoming more awake to what is real and what we are being told, and challenging people who are delivering those narratives to explain themselves. This one example of us, a conservation group coming in and halting the drilling on federal lands, to think about, how much we've changed and how much innovations happened for the wells that we've already drilled. It's very similar to what Convoy says, is like, how do we become more efficient? Are there wells that we should be revisiting before we go into federal lands? There's just a lot of nuances here. And I think this ends up becoming kind of, a headline that we can talk around, but maybe it's a little bit distracting. And so what I would hope is that we don't have to drill on federal lands, that we can utilize and tap into the resources that we have, and also be, using the investment dollars that we can to further invest into more, sustainable fuels. The episode we did on hydrogen was super interesting with Mike from Bakken Energy. I did one last week with Eric Rubenstein, who's the founding managing partner at New Climate Ventures, and he's talking about how we can use carbon to create sustainable products and fuels and food. And so those things excite me. Drilling on federal land does not, just to put it simply. And so I think it ends up becoming one of these hot button topics that ultimately I think is distracting.
I think that there's so much nuance, as you said, when it comes to this, and a lot of that has to even do with whose land it was and is to begin with, because a lot of the federal land was land that was stolen or taken from indigenous tribes during colonization and during Western expansion. And a lot of that nuance that the government, I think, has to handle now too is you have tribes who are standing up and advocates for tribes who are standing up and saying, this land belongs to us, and starting to take that reclamation of the lands that were once theirs. And can you talk a little bit about how that fits into things, and if there is any, I guess, kind of pushback, or what the government reception is to these groups who are standing up for that land reclamation?
You know, I think as a nation, like I said, we're becoming more awake, right, and understanding um, the historical context for us as a nation, and the things that we did to build this nation, and coming to terms with those and how do we deal with them. Um, it's great that we're talking, and for you to be bringing it up is fantastic. More people should be talking about it, and it does. I want to say complicate, but it it hopefully situates us so we can be thinking about our decisions in a more holistic way. And I know those types of terms, and even just saying those words, can rub some people the wrong way because they kind of feel like, I don't know, that they're of maybe a more progressive way of viewing things, and that's not necessarily for everyone. What's unfortunate, I think, is that these words do, the way that we do speak, the words that we do use to describe things end up creating reactions, emotions for people. And it stands in the way of us really coming together to talk about these things that aren't, they're nuanced, but they're not very complex. I mean, the history of our nation is not a very complex one to understand. It's just very clear cut, but we make it complex by, I think, making a polarization around it. And so what I hope is that, like you said, that people are understanding, like, oh, it's not just about, I grew up in Texas. I'm from Houston. It's kind of a birthright to be championing for drilling for oil, right? And so having the perspective now to understand, like, how these lands were formed, how the history of drilling, how it fits into our economy, and really just to your point, the ultimate ownership of the land and how that has transformed as we have we settled this, this nation. I now live in Richmond, Virginia, which is just north of the oldest English settlement in our country, in Jamestown. And it is just kind of crazy once you start to understand and realize and appreciate what was going on before we developed this country, and then having that perspective as we move forward is hugely important. I think it's one of those things from a cultural perspective that we have a lot of work to do to situate ourselves more broadly in a way to receive those messages and to hear these things. But ultimately, I think it can't happen soon enough. But the fact that we are talking about it is healthy. And so, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it's not a topic that is brought up really on its own, hardly ever. And so I think it's one that we should need to highlight as well.
And it's definitely not easy to talk about, because it causes, as you mentioned, a lot of conflicting feelings to come up for people to talk about that. And I want to kind of bring this discussion back to transportation focus. And a lot of the people who are for this expansion of domestic drilling and domestic production use these buzzwords of energy independence, right? Of getting off of reliance on foreign sources for energy and really transitioning it back to U.S. produced, U.S. made, U.S. refined, putting it back into the U.S. economy. But as you mentioned, we're seeing net exports of oil and gas right now as well, and a lot of that has to go with supporting the global conflict. But that also happens in times of not global conflict too, where we've got net energy exports. Can you talk about what role, I guess, more drilling, if that drilling happens to be on federal land, would truly play in the transportation sector? Is it something that's needed, or do we have enough to get by with what we're currently doing? And really, is this just seeking that energy independence that's kind of pushed forward by so many right now?
Yeah, and energy independence doesn't need to mean hydrocarbons, right? Like,
right.
Yes, we need energy to fuel, right? But it doesn't mean that we have to continue to drill oil. Well, going back to the hydrogen example, right? Like, getting on to more sustainable fuels. Sustainable fuels, I think, is what we should be using in replace of energy independence. Like, it will come with that. Right. But like, if we do a good job of really leaning into sustainable fuels, understanding what the different options are, and preparing ourselves for adoption, and what we need to work on is scale and pricing. Right. And so the market needs to send a signal to the producers that this stuff is important. Right. It's increasingly more important. But it is a very hard thing to think about. When we talked a little bit about on some of the episodes is again this concept of drop-in fuels. So we're creating synthetic fuels that are truly drop-in, that can be used in the existing infrastructure, the existing vehicles, without any modifications. And in a lot of situations, those synthetic fuels or those drop-in fuels, sustainable fuels, have better attributes as it pertains, obviously, to emissions, but also to wear on the engines. And so, I think it's happening. The education part, I think, is where we're at right now, educating people about these, and why I think the Net Zero Carbon Show is so important. Sponsorships from people like Convoy and others, and just a collective industry push to heighten the demand for these things, because at the end of the day, the producers aren't going to switch or to push sustainable fuels if there's not enough demand out there for it, right? They're producing to fit the demand, and so I think it's on our industry to start to think about how do we send that demand signal to the producers, and we can do that in a way where we start to prioritize, more sustainable freight. And so you do that by paying up for those services. And so I know it's a hard concept to think about, because everyone is really trying, especially in this economy, to run as efficiently from a capital perspective as possible. But just like, we have a choice when we go to the grocery store to, what types of produce we buy, what types of dairy we purchase, what type of packaging we're willing to use. Those are sending signals to retailers, and we need to do the same thing for fuel producers.
Last question before we let you go, Danny. Do you think that there is a role of private landowners who maybe traditionally have oil and gas wells on their land to maybe step up and say, hey, you know what, let's come and investigate this one more time. Let's come check out and see what I've got, my mineral rights, my land rights. Come take a look at this and see if we can use what already exists before we go and jump out into more property.
Yeah, I just assume that's happening, hopefully already, as people, especially as, energy prices change, people start to get a bit more creative. I was in oil and gas in my previous life, and what we used to talk about is what methods are usable at certain price levels, right? And so horizontal drilling is one of those things that needed a right environment for it to take off, and we were able to perfect it at the right price levels, and then now it's the price of doing horizontal drilling has greatly reduced, and the technology has advanced. And so, as we think about what pressures are put on us in order for us to be more innovative, there's already a lot. Price can do that, but maybe also social pressure. So if we are saying that, look, we're not going to be able to just continue to expand the footprint of the places we drill, that we're going to have to work in a more confined or traditionally used spaces, I'm sure that will drive innovation as well.
And Danny, right now we're seeing record level fuel prices and short-term spikes right now. Do you see this potentially throwing off the long-term trajectory that we're really aiming for and really being able to stay the course?
Hopefully not. I don't think so. I think it's obviously a big focus right now. We need to think about things, but as it pertains to, it's a feather in the cap for the person who's trying to advocate for historical energy independence. But I think there is so much social pressure right now and so much awareness around environmental impacts that I think it's going to be hard to quiet that groundswell. I think we're really just in the early innings. And the example that I give of, Houston being a hydrogen hub, the people who are traditionally producing oil, right, for them to be to see them shift, these are companies that have done a lot of research and have a lot of investments and have a lot of, they don't want, their chapter is not going to end when oil production ends. They're going to likely help us lead this transition, and so I think they're in it for the long haul as well.
All right, Danny. Well, thank you for being with us today and providing your perspective on this. It's a great conversation that we need to be having. You can catch Net Zero Carbon on Fridays right here on Freightwaves TV. Right now, we're going to head back over to the wall. We've got our next carrier update this morning from Donnie and Tony.